Bosses. 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 From being a point of narrative, to testing player knowledge, to filling all my holes with swords, bosses are an integral part of any video game worth its salt. The NameBeSam definition of a boss is any particularly devious individual or group of individuals that takes a little more effort or thinking to conquer than a regular enemy. Modern bosses are often grand spectacles or incredibly designed challenges. So how did we get from this to this, and why? Find out on the second episode of blank, in parentheses, a history. In the earliest days of gaming, everything was pretty much just Pong. Now don't get me wrong, Pong fucks, but it doesn't leave a lot of room for a boss battle. When slightly more advanced systems rolled around in the mid-70s, devs got more ambitious, especially with their enemy design. Dungeons & Dragons, when digitally adapted for the Play-Doh console in 1975, was responsible for the first official boss fight against the Golden Dragon, this thing. Not super exhilarating, but it was still an important first step. A first step not that many people know about because the Play-Doh console sold approximately 4 units. Once the focus shifted to arcades in the 80s, better hardware and new gameplay loops caused the idea of a boss battle to explode in popularity. Sega's 1980 action game Samurai saw this pixel dipshit fight a group of ninjas before fighting the titular samurai. This samurai guy was the most fucked up, evil, unconquerable enemy in the gaming world until this point. But why? See, the regular guys took 1 hit to kill. This vile monster took 2 hits to kill. This is the boss battle in its most basic form. An enemy that gives you a little extra trouble with no other differences. Better hardware like the NES, SNES, and Genesis NES encouraged devs to add bigger fights. Icons began to emerge. Bowser, Dracula, Yellow Devil, real-life Mike Tyson and his special bite-off-ear move. All iconic battles that, while not particularly advanced, pushed the design envelope a little bit. Since games didn't particularly care about narrative yet, bosses didn't need to either, but gameplay-wise, they were evolving forward. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, games went 3D. Just like physics, good video, go watch after, with a third dimension, more shit had to be considered to make a good boss. In Mario 64, fights against Bowser were in a round arena surrounded by bombs. The game asked the player to use positioning and perception in a 3D space to launch his ass into the bombs from a distance. This concept was new to most players, so the 3 fights were rolled out with increasing difficulty. The approach of a 3D fight and ramping difficulty were considered new-ish concepts with the release of Mario 64. Previously, games would kinda just toss your ass into a room and throw a guy at you. But now, stuff had to be introduced and ramped up to introduce the player effectively. The weak point was also established as a boss staple in 3D games. A lot of devs were hit with the question of how do you translate a boss's weakness into a 3D game? The answer most games took was just give the boss a big glowy spot or a big fucking eye in the middle. Ocarina of Time had a habit of pointing out weak points and designing a whole boss around them. For example, Bongo Bongo, which requires a hit to the eye to stun. This era of boss design was all about positioning, perception, ramping difficulty, and experimentation in a new and kinda fucked up dimension. In the 2000s, the spectacle and narrative impact of boss battles was truly established, thanks to a sharp hike in hardware quality once again, and more AAA 3D games coming out. The fighting game boss was perfected with Giga Bowser and Melee. Hack and slash bosses were evolving alongside the God of War franchise with fights like Ares, and horror games started to get a little creative with dudes like El Lago from Resident Evil 4. In regards to bosses in general though, there were 2 very notable games that pushed the boundaries of what a boss can be and how important they were. Shadow of the Colossus and Demon's Souls. Shadow of the Colossus is dope. I have not played Shadow of the Colossus, but using the power of YouTube I can pretend I have. And the way this game goes about progression is very unique, because it revolves entirely around boss fights. What really makes Shadow of the Colossus unique though is the colossal size of these fights. For a game made in 2005, these behemoths are still super impressive and function as both enemies and stages. For Big Gunga over here, you gotta jump on his wing, climb across his flapping body, and stab him on his weak point. The scope and design of these bosses had never been seen before and would go on to influence boss design in narrative and spectacle applications. Demon's Souls bosses are far less impressive, but far more screwed up. Demon's Souls ushered the birth of the Soulsborne series, the most important series of games to look for when discussing boss fights. Demon's Souls didn't have many outstanding fights, but Penetrator, Tower Knight, Old King Allant, and Flame Lurker set the standard for boss design and difficulty. These fights were tough but fair, as opposed to the old method of tough but go fuck yourself. A lot of bosses during this time period were pushovers, so to have a game consistently challenge the player in interesting ways through boss fights was a new-ish concept. especially new when done well. By the 2010s, most developers had figured out how to make a good boss fight. Oh my god. Ginormous scale bosses became mainstream, and a lot more games started to strike that balance of tough but fair. The Soul series continuously ramped up complexity and difficulty, with standout fights like Artorias, Fume Knight, Gale, and Ishin. 3D Mario games continued their trend of experimentation with gravity-based fights in Galaxy, and possession-based fights in Odyssey. Open-world games and first-person shooters implemented fights in unique ways. Most importantly, the best boss fight in any video game ever was created.
Klungo.